I'm gonna be the first one to admit right off the bat that this right here is in fact a how-to video. It's like an overview of the rigging technique I use. You could call it a retrievable rigging line setup, a solo rigging system, or I kind of prefer the term a fixed line rigging setup. I did not invent the system, but I use it a lot, and I've just been asked by people, you know, just kind of like, how do you do it? What's the deal? So this is how I do it and the deal. Okay. All right, now the way I'm gonna go through this is with a kind of simulation, and you've got to meet Freddie the tree climber. He's working on a fixed rope system. Freddie's on a single rope. He could be on a double. He could be on spikes using lanyards, whatever, but he's ready to go kind of up here at this crotch to take out these limbs. Now, while Freddie prefers to swing out, chop and drop, just let stuff hit the ground, in this case, he's got like a dollhouse down underneath the tree. He's got to rig things down. So he has brought a rigging line up into the tree. It was like hooked to his funky Cheever 3.0 saddle. First thing he does is set this rigging line up nice and high. And it's kind of like the first principle of a fixed line system is to affix the line in the tree. And as with most lines, just like with your climbing system, it's better to get that thing hooked up nice and high. So Freddie's gonna climb up and he's gonna fix this thing high in the tree. Just like with any other rigging system, he's gonna keep it separate from his climb line just so there's no friction and rubbing and stuff like that. Now this point is what I would call high and away, just because the line as it comes down is a little bit away from our man Freddie and from the trunk of the tree. That will help him move the material away as well. Now if you wanted to move everything in this direction, like back behind the tree, it would behoove Freddie to set the line back and away. Up high, but on the other side of the tree, the drop point on that line is back behind. So if he wants to be spinning material back behind the tree, that would be a more desirable anchor point. But Freddie decides he wants to drop this stuff out here, kind of away from the stem in this direction. So he sets his anchor point up here and he's ready to go with step 2. All right, now Freddie's goal is to take this limb out. He wants this thing to go bye-bye. So it's gonna take a little bit of a limb walk. All right, so this is the bad boy in question. Kind of like the low one. He accomplishes the unimaginable, does a limb walk out to, in this case, kind of like the balance point on the limb. He pulls a sling out of his harness. Oh, okay, it's like the longest. All right, big sling, too big probably, but gets it around the limb. He's kind of balancing, he's feeling a little funky. Freddie loops the rigging line through his beaner and he's making it back to where he's gonna make his cut. Oh, I need this, don't I? Now note that a bunch of these variables are flexible. Like Fred does not need to put the sling out here. He just wants to be able to control this limb. He doesn't want it to just drop. If he was feeling droppy with this limb, like he wanted to just flop this thing and control it, he could set the rigging point here. Like he could put it anywhere on this limb. He could do a spider leg, whatever. But the key point of the retrievable fixed line rigging system is that you are not tying on to the limb. This limb is not tied onto with the rope. Instead, it is just looped through a sling. If he was taking this dude out and he wanted to, he could actually just use this crotch to connect. Like you don't even necessarily need to have a sling. If there was enough weight beyond the crotch to flop this limb in this direction, he could use the crotch. But a sling is a good bet. It also allows you a smoother retrieval, as we'll see in a bit. Now step 1 was to tie the line up high in the tree. Step 2 was to affix that line somehow to the branch or whatever you're cutting. In this case, he used the sling, he put it kind of far out. And now the third thing Freddie is gonna do is establish his control point with the rigging line. Now, there are a bunch of ways to do this, but in this case, Freddie's a little bit freaked out and he's gonna use a lowering device of some kind, either a figure 8 or a small porter wrap or some other gizmo designed to create a little bit of friction, like to slow stuff down after he makes his cut. So still dragging the rigging line with him, Freddie climbs up to his friction device. He's in a little bit of a free fall, and he engages the friction device. This will allow Freddie the friction and control he wants to sort of master that limb so it doesn't get away from him. And at that point, and this is kind of important, he tightens everything up, even to the point that as he tensions, he's even getting a little bit of lift on his branch. Okay, so my man Fred has his rigging line tied high. He's got it attached to his limb with a sling. The rigging line runs through the sling. It goes up to his friction device. In this case, the ratchet wrench, the newest friction device available to climbers. And from where he's positioned, his climb line is not entangled in the rigging line. It's not like up against it or anything like that. He's ready to make his cut, and he can either right away or with doing a little climbing, reach his control point when it comes time to bring this limb down. So double tight in, he comes in, makes a directional notch underneath just because he wants this limb to kind of swing a little bit. The rigging line is kind of holding the branch up. So Freddie starts taking the tension out of the system, and the limb just slowly kind of cracks off. All right, there we go. Oh. Freddie's kind of psyched. He's got control of the limb through the wrench wrap friction device he's using, and he begins to lower. Now, note that Freddie is kind of short rope in this one. His orange rigging line is not super long. He notes everything's clear down below, loosens the line, and the limb falls off. Bye-bye. Now, if you want control with your rigging line all the way to the ground, and usually you probably do, if you want that kind of control, you need a line that is twice the length from your tie point up top to the base of the tree. Twice the length, because then you can come all the way down to the ground with your limb, have the line come all the way back up to your control point, and still be in control of the limb. When you get touched down with the limb, then you can kind of ease it down, direct it, drop the end of the rigging line, and pull it up through the beaner. Another thing to note is that there is mechanical advantage built into the system and a whole set of vectors to kind of pay attention to. So if my limb was just loaded directly right here with a knot, you would have the weight of the limb on the sling, and that's it. But once you make this turn and come up to your device, you have a mechanical advantage on the piece. Close to a 2-to-1 if you're doing a direct pull. If your tie point up top and your control point are not in a straight line, it's not gonna be a straight up 2-to-1, but you have mechanical advantage here, and then you have it again at your device. If your device provides friction or resistance in some way, again, more friction in the system. So while a limb can get heavy for a climber to handle, like I'm not saying it can't, there is mechanical advantage in the system. If you're using big enough diameter rope and attachment gear, etc., just like in a regular rigging system, you can bring down some pretty heavy stuff. As long as you avoid the big shock load. If you shock load the system, just like any system, that's where you get into trouble. Now, just to set up another example with a sort of different situation, let's say our man Fred wants to take out this limb down here at the base. He's not worried about swinging it or anything. He just wants to control the descent. It's also not a big tree where Fred's going to be climbing all over doing a ton of stuff. This is just one limb over the swimming pool or garage or patio, whatever, and he's just coming up to take out this limb, maybe one more. In this case, he sets up down close to the limb, ties on his rigging line, not super high, it's still out of the way of his climbing system and everything, loops it around the beaner, uses his stub for his control point, half hitches it off. Oh man, Fred's saw's falling off. Grabs his big saw and makes his cut. And similar to before, Fred just needs to get over to his rigging line where he's got his control, takes it off the stub. He's still got some mechanical advantage on the piece, and he just lets it down easy. And when the piece hits the ground, pulls that rigging line out of the beaner and he's ready for another cut. Now, having done this a bunch of times, Fred knows a few pitfalls with the system. One is that he needs to have a lot of slings with him, kind of like with the speed line system, but there's no speed about it. And of course, when he gets down there or when his crew's working down below, they got to retrieve all those slings from the pieces. Also, if he's using this as a solo rigging line setup, like he's got no one on the ground working with him, if Fred uses too long of a rigging line, like a big long rope that's dangling on the ground, when the limbs hit the ground, they can put too much weight on it, tie it up, just make the line impossible to retrieve off the ground. As feared, piece down below. It's completely on the line. For that reason, if I'm doing a big tree with a bunch of rigging, I will sometimes bring up 2-3 rigging lines. Yeah, so just setting up a couple lines, just in case they get bound up down below and stuff. I'll weird it out. Hang them high in the tree, and when one gets tied up, I can always go to the second rigging line or the third. Another critical thing to keep in mind is that if you've got your tie-in point up top, your piece is connected down below on a sling, or it's attached to the crotch or whatever you got going on, rigging line comes back up to your control point, you create that triangle of death where you do not want to be hanging out. You know, about halfway through that cut, I thought, is that gonna swing back and hit me in the face? And yeah, it did, but gently, you know, like in a kind of loving, soft way. Freddy, in this case, is out of the way, but if this piece was a swinger and it was coming back in from over a structure, he could definitely be in the triangle of death. You got to set this system up so you are up and out of the way. Ideally, everything's going on down below you, and everything that is moving way down below you, so you're not getting strapped by the lines or hit by pieces or whatever other horrible things could possibly happen. And keep in mind that rigging a piece down is for at least 2 reasons. One is to control the speed and descent of the piece, so you're not just flopping stuff down and blowing out the yard and everything. The other is to control the location. So if my tie point and my control point are pretty much the same, you're gonna get a straight drop beneath that. But if I move my control point over, you're splitting the difference on the actual location of the piece. So not only controlling the speed of descent, but also the location of the material when it comes down to planet Earth. So with Freddy's help, that is a basic overview of the way I think of and kind of orchestrate or manage or whatever a fixed line system, or a retrievable solo, sometimes called solo rigging line. But the thing about the solo lingo is that it implies that you have to use this rigging setup if you're working alone. Now, some of us tend to work alone, others with crews. There's like a ton of debate out there. I'm not necessarily advocating the system for you. Like if you got a good system and the majority of rigging that is done, like 99.999% in the tree world, is with a limb tied system. That's just like what people tend to do. This is all the educated climber's knot. He calls it like the Siberian gooseneck or something, but it's awesome, just a good slip knot. Tie the limb, control the rigging line both in the tree and with someone at the base. So I'm not necessarily saying you should roll solo now that you know this technique, or even that this technique should only be used if you're out there working alone. In the small amount of contract climbing I've done with other crews, there's sometimes that downtime between tying a piece, getting it down, and then waiting for your line to come back up and everyone to get set and the piece out of the way. During that downtime, I have solo rigged out some smaller pieces. You want me to swing it a little bit off that tree? Here we go.
Go ahead.
Just to keep working, get things out of the way. I tend to think it's an efficient way to get material down to the ground if you're working solo or with a crew. It's also worth mentioning that, like with all systems, if one link in the chain is bogus, like your sling, for instance, or your lowering device or whatever, if one part's bogus, the whole thing falls apart. Similarly, if you don't have a really excellent tie-in point for that rigging line, the whole thing's just gonna suck. Generally, like with climb lines, higher is better. Just a higher tie point with that rigging line allows you more control and movement and just positioning as you bring pieces down with that retrievable system. All right, so it absolutely was a how-to video. And if you're interested in the ratcheting wrench rigging device, we are getting very close to production on these babies.